Welcome to my channel Deepstream. Subscribe to my channel for news updates all around the world. In March 2025, British Columbia made a move that reverberated from the Pacific all the way to Washington, D.C. The decision sent shockwaves through political and economic circles, capturing the attention of both local citizens and international observers. It was a moment that would redefine the relationship between Canada's westernmost province and its powerful neighbor to the south. The province introduced the Economic Stabilization, Tariff Response Act, a bold piece of legislation granting itself the power to impose steep tolls on commercial vehicles traveling to or from Alaska. This was a significant escalation, targeting the very arteries that keep Alaska connected to the rest of the United States. This was no diplomatic gesture, it was a direct warning, a clear signal that British Columbia was prepared to defend its interest with real consequences if provoked. The law was a contingency, a loaded weapon to be used only if the U.S. followed through on its tariff threats. Lawmakers debated fiercely, aware that the stakes were high for both economies. Deputy Premier Nikki Sharma called it a defensive measure, not an act of aggression. She emphasized that British Columbia was not seeking conflict but would not be caught unprepared. The tolls would target the Alaska Highway and possibly coastal ferries, vital arteries for Alaska's supply chain. These routes are lifelines, carrying food, fuel, and goods to communities that depend on them year-round. The act was temporary, set to expire in May 2027, signaling a response to a specific crisis. It was designed as a measured, time-limited tool, not a permanent fixture of cross-border relations. Premier David Eby described the situation as an economic war initiated by the U.S., framing the tolls as a necessary shield. He spoke of the need to protect British Columbia's workers, industries, and communities from external threats. He emphasized that confrontation was not their goal, but they wouldn't stand by while facing hostile rhetoric from their closest ally. The government hoped for dialogue, but was ready for escalation if forced. The legislation was precise, targeting the highways and ferries that connect Alaska to the rest of the U.S. It was a strategic move, carefully crafted to maximize leverage while minimizing collateral damage. The message was unmistakable. If you hurt our economy, we'll respond in kind. British Columbia was drawing a line in the sand, making it clear that it would not be bullied. British Columbia was preparing for an economic battle, not seeking one. Behind closed doors, officials strategized, hoping for peace but bracing for the worst. The government made clear this was a last resort, not a first strike. They wanted to resolve the dispute through negotiation, not escalation. The stage was set for a major international showdown. Tensions simmered as both sides waited to see who would blink first. The world watched as a provincial government took a stand against a superpower. The outcome would have ripple effects far beyond the Pacific Northwest. The first domino had fallen, and no one could predict how far the chain reaction would reach. To understand why British Columbia took such a drastic and unprecedented step, you have to look south, at President Trump's revived and aggressive trade war rhetoric, which sent shockwaves across the border. In early 2025, Trump threatened to impose a sweeping 25% tariff on all Canadian goods entering the United States, a move that experts warned could devastate Canada's already fragile economy and disrupt thousands of jobs. But the threats didn't stop at economics. Trump's talk of possible annexation and even hints at military action left Canadians stunned and deeply unsettled, sparking fears of a crisis unlike any before. Premier David Eby responded swiftly, calling Trump a direct threat to Canada's sovereignty and security, which only escalated the sense of national crisis and urgency in Ottawa and across the provinces. The idea of annexation, however outlandish it seemed at first, quickly changed the tone from a heated trade dispute to an existential threat, dominating headlines and fueling public anxiety. The combination of economic threats and inflammatory rhetoric forced Canadian leaders to prepare for the worst-case scenario, holding emergency meetings and ramping up contingency plans. BC's sudden tolls on the Alaska Highway were a direct and calculated response, a clear signal that any U.S. escalation would be met with immediate, tangible consequences for Alaska and its vital supply routes. The situation quickly became a high-stakes game of brinkmanship, with both sides maneuvering for advantage and the world watching closely. The Alaska Highway tolls were a strategic move, not just a bluff, designed to remind Washington of Canada's leverage and the real-world impact of political threats. British Columbia was sending a message to Washington: escalate further, and you'll pay a price that can't be ignored. The stakes had never been higher for the US-Canada relationship, with trust eroding and the future of cross-border cooperation hanging in the balance. The firestorm was just beginning, and no one could predict how far it might spread. President Trump's response was classic unpredictability. In March 2025, he delayed the threatened tariffs for 1 month, creating a temporary pause but not removing the threat. Simultaneously, he expanded tariff exemptions under USMCA, sending mixed signals. Was this de-escalation, or just a tactical pause? Trump's tough rhetoric continued, framing the dispute as a fight for American workers. His base cheered, but Canadian leaders remained anxious. The delay did nothing to ease BC's concerns. The threat was only postponed. For BC, Trump's move reinforced the need for their own counter-threat. The Alaska route tolls remained on the table, ready to be triggered. The uncertainty kept everyone on edge. The conflict was paused, not resolved. The danger was still very real. For Alaska, BC's toll threat was a direct hit to its lifeline. While most cargo arrives by sea, urgent and high-value goods, fresh produce, medical supplies, oil equipment, depend on trucks traveling the Alaska Highway. This legendary road is Alaska's critical artery, connecting it to the rest of the U.S. Disrupting this route would mean higher costs, delays, and potential shortages. Alaska's geographic isolation makes it uniquely vulnerable. There's no alternative land route. Sea transport is too slow for many essentials. The proposed tolls threaten to upend decades of reliable supply chains. Businesses and consumers would bear the brunt. The cost of living would rise and economic stability would be shaken. Alaska's dependence on Canada is a geographic reality. The BC legislation put that relationship and Alaska's stability at risk. The stakes for Alaska were immediate and severe. Alaska's response was swift and anxious. As news of the dispute spread, state officials scrambled to assess the potential fallout, knowing that Alaska's remote location made it especially vulnerable to disruptions. Governor Mike Dunleavy urgently called on both federal governments to resolve the dispute diplomatically, warning that Alaskans shouldn't be pawns in a trade war. He emphasized that the livelihoods of everyday people were on the line, and that political gamesmanship could have real, devastating consequences for families across the state. State Senator Robert Myers warned of empty grocery shelves and disruptions to the oil industry if tolls were imposed. He pointed out that Alaska's supply chains are fragile, and even a small disruption could quickly spiral into a crisis for communities that rely on regular shipments for food and fuel. The Alaska Trucking Association predicted soaring shipping costs and supply chain chaos. Truckers faced the prospect of longer routes, higher expenses, and uncertainty about whether essential goods would reach their destinations on time. For truckers and businesses, the threat was personal. Livelihoods were at stake. Small business owners worried about keeping their doors open, and workers feared for their jobs as the situation grew more tense. Alaska's unique vulnerability left its leaders feeling unfairly targeted. The state's isolation meant it had fewer options and less leverage than others, making the threat even more acute. They had no control over Washington's actions but faced the harshest consequences. Decisions made thousands of miles away could upend daily life in Alaska overnight. Frustration mounted as the state was caught in the crossfire. Community meetings grew tense and residents voiced their fears about what the future might hold. The well-being of 730,000 Alaskans hung in the balance. Every family, from the largest city to the smallest village, felt the uncertainty looming over their daily routines. Their plea was simple: let diplomacy and common sense prevail. Alaskans hoped leaders would put aside differences and find a peaceful solution before real harm was done. The stakes were not abstract, they were about food, jobs, and daily life. For Alaskans, this was about survival, not politics. Alaska needed a solution, not a standoff. The state's leaders and citizens stood united, hoping for a resolution that would protect their way of life and ensure a stable future. British Columbia wasn't alone. Other provinces quickly rallied in support. Prime Minister Trudeau announced retaliatory tariffs, calling Trump's threats very dumb. Ontario's Premier Doug Ford imposed a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to the U.S., targeting states reliant on Canadian power. Even the Yukon joined in, banning American liquor and restricting U.S. companies from government contracts. The message economic pain could flow both ways. From the largest provinces to the smallest territories, Canada presented a united front. The provinces coordinated strategies, refusing to let BC stand alone. The response was a powerful show of national solidarity. Canada made clear it would not be bullied. If the US wanted conflict, it would face a determined, unified opponent. The border had never felt so fortified. US politicians searched for leverage, and found it in BC's cruise ship industry. Alaska Senator Dan Sullivan proposed waiving a law that requires foreign-flagged cruise ships to stop in Canada en route to Alaska. This would allow ships to bypass Vancouver and Victoria, threatening millions in tourism revenue. Nearly 1.9 million cruise passengers were expected in BC in 2025, losing them would devastate local economies. The threat was precise, aimed at BC's economic weak spot. BC officials insisted their cities were desirable destinations, not just technical stops. But behind the confidence, concern was real. The American threat to bypass BC ports added a new dimension to the dispute. The cruise ship gambit was a direct shot at BC's prosperity. The economic battle was now hitting both sides' most vulnerable industries. The escalation continued. BC's response went beyond tolls. Premier Eby announced a Buy Canadian policy, halting government purchases of American products. BC liquor stores immediately stopped selling alcohol from Republican-led states, including Alaska. The move was symbolic and strategic, personalizing the conflict and targeting political divisions in the US. These measures showed BC wasn't bluffing, it was willing to absorb pain to inflict it. The province was disentangling its economy from certain US states. The retaliation was multi-pronged tolls, trade bans, and targeted boycotts. BC signaled its resolve to fight on several fronts. The message to Washington: this was a long fight, and BC was prepared. The conflict was now deeply political and economic. This trade war was more than headlines, it threatened real people. In Alaska, tolls would mean higher prices, supply disruptions, and job losses. In BC, losing cruise tourism would devastate thousands of workers and businesses. The economic well-being of entire communities hung in the balance. The US and Canada shared deep ties: trade, culture, and family. This dispute risked unraveling decades of cooperation and trust. When neighbors become adversaries, repairing the relationship is hard. The human cost was clear. Jobs, livelihoods, and stability were at stake. Leaders faced a choice: escalate or pull back from the brink. The world was watching to see if common sense would prevail. The future of the US-Canada partnership depended on it.